you for joining us today. I'm Mary Beth Vitale, and I am a director with CoBiz Financial and have chaired comp committees. I am the moderator for today's webinar on the top 5 compensation questions boards should be asking in 2017. I believe we can all agree this has been an unprecedented election season. Now there is considerable speculation about deregulation, and opinions on what corporate America can expect are many, and they're varied. What do boards have to do to prepare for this new and unconventional administration? Today, I'm joined by 3 managing directors from Perlmeyer: David Bixby, head of the firm's Houston office, Terry Neuth in the Boston office, and Deb Lefshay based in New York. They are going to help us understand what a post-compliance era might mean for compensation committees. We'll discuss the key questions boards should be asking, the pressing issues that should be addressed now, and recommendations for developing an actionable plan for long-term value creation in 2017. Before we begin, Renelle Perry with NACD's education team has a few housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Audience, please submit a question and receive your answer directly from Perlmeyer on today's webinar. If you do this, you will also be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from our partner, Perlmeyer. Also, remember, you can tweet live about today's event with NACD and Perlmeyer. The presentation slides are available for download at the URL on the screen and right within the webinar console. Also, you will automatically receive 1 NACD skill credit for your participation. Your credit can be applied to NACD fellowship programs, and for more information, follow the email address on the screen. The replay of the slides will be available early next week at nacdonline.org and perlmeyer.com. Mary Beth, back to you.
Thanks, Fidel. To set the context for our top 5 questions in 2017, Perlmeyer's David Bixby will get us started on what we can expect on that front. David?
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you, everybody, for taking a little bit of your time today to listen to what we think are some of the most important questions for compensation committees to consider heading into 2017. As Mary Beth noted leading off the webcast today, the world was turned on its ear this November with the results of the presidential election, and the prognostication regarding what to expect on the regulatory and legislative front runs the gamut, as you can see from some of the quotations we have on the slide here. All the way from the sky is falling and everything's on the table to nothing much is really going to change. But the truth, I think, is going to be somewhere in the middle. Some of the questions that people are asking heading into 2017 are we entering a post-compliance driven era to a new era of deregulation? What rules are coming and which that we thought were going to be in place are going to be gone? And what action should committees be taking in the face of all this uncertainty? And the short answer here is stay the course, but like all good Boy Scouts, be prepared. So I think it's time now for the first of our several polling questions today to try to gather your point of view on what's happening out there. So first of all, we're interested in hearing your perspective regarding what we can expect. Where will we see the most change? Where are we most likely to see change, that is? I would certainly expect to see some changes in the Dodd-Frank provisions, particularly those that are still outstanding. I think there may well be some changes in store for the proxy advisory firms.
Well, I think another thing that this is such an important question as a director, really we have 3 responsibilities: strategy, hire and fire, and compensate the CEO, and the last really is compliance and accuracy and how to mitigate risks. And all of these areas may see changes. We'll see what everyone thinks of on the call here, but these are areas of responsibility to make sure that we are complying with all of the rules and regs.
Thank you. I agree. So let's take a look at what we've got here. Interesting. So the most likely area for change is the tax code, followed closely by Dodd-Frank, which is one of the areas that we're certainly focused on. So we have a follow-up question here, which is now that we know what everybody thinks is most likely to change, where do you think we're most in need of change out of these categories?
Well, and I think, this is where a comp committee can really start to get involved, is that, and if you're not already, is that it's incumbent that the chair or the comp committee as a whole, you should write some advocacy letters to the SEC or the appropriate, agency of how it impacts your particular business. A lot of times there's blanket letters that go out, that the company has written, and then in a format. But when they hear directly from a comp chair, it really has an impact when you relate to how it impacts your business. So it does put some onus on us when you do want to see changes on certain things to go ahead and initiate those.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Mary Beth. That's a great thing to have in mind. So let's see what everybody had to say. Sort of lines up with where we think the changes are most likely to happen. Tax code, then Dodd-Frank, proxy advisor regulation, interesting, and then FLSA, which actually we're supposed to, some changes there were supposed to go into effect today, but they've been temporarily delayed. So following up those polling questions, we're going to move on. I'm going to hand off here to Deb Lifshay, a member of our technical services team and a managing director in our New York office, who's going to walk through some of our expectations regarding the regulatory front.
Thank you. All right, here we go. So I think the theme of my 3 slides here are uncertainty and enigma, which is sort of not unlike the results of the election. We are hearing a lot of talk about deregulation, and the title of the slide is deregulation. But what does that really mean? If we look at Dodd-Frank itself, only a small portion of those regulations are really related to executive compensation. Many of them are aimed simply at straight, banking laws and finance laws. So when we think about it, we don't think that Dodd-Frank Act is going to be repealed 100%, but people will be looking at bits and pieces of it. They're also looking at where in the stage of rulemaking we are. We've 6 years have passed since Dodd-Frank was enacted in 2010, and both in compensation and the other types of regs, only certain of those provisions have been finalized. Many are still in proposed stages, and some of them have not even been touched at all by the SEC and other rulemaking bodies. So we're sort of in a state of flux. We don't think that everything will be completely taken apart on Dodd-Frank. Where we think the focus will be in the near term will really be on the 3 provisions governing the pay ratio, clawbacks, and the pay for performance disclosure. If we dig a little deeper on the next slide, we'll look at each of these provisions in terms of the executive compensation sections and give you our best guess. When we look at the president-elect himself, even his views are sort of all over the place. On one hand, we read a lot of articles that he's a populist and he wants to take down corporate America, and on the other hand, we have the current cabinet members that have just been put in place, and Trump has also been highly critical of the Dodd-Frank Act. So on one hand, you have certain views. On the other, you have another view. So we're still in a phase of unfolding and trying to figure out where this is going. Below Trump, of course, we have the House and the Senate, controlled by Republicans now, and they've certainly expressed their objection to all of Dodd-Frank, really. The chair of the Financial Services Committee introduced the Financial Choice Act, which would really repeal a lot of the pieces of the executive compensation portion of Dodd-Frank, but that sort of just it's in a holding phase. We also have to look at the rulemaking body itself for the executive compensation portion, the SEC and the commissioners. We already know that Mary Jo White is stepping down and Kara Stein as well, and usually 3 out of the 5 commissioners are aligned with the current party, so 3 of 5 will be Republicans, and we usually they will not, they won't be confirmed until at least summer of 2017. So really what we see in the next 6 months is rulemaking somewhat in the executive compensation world at a standstill. What's really front and center for most of us at this point is the CEO pay ratio rule, because that's one of the rules that's newly finalized that would be applicable for reporting in the 2018 proxy, and that concerns compensation that is going to be payable starting next month with 2017 pay. So our best guess on that one is stay the course, assume it will go into place, and we'll sort of wait and see. This chart runs through some of the other provisions. Our say on pay, say on frequency. It's been going on for 6 years. It's a well-oiled mechanism for most companies at this point. We don't see any change there. We don't see any change in the requirements for compensation committee independence or reporting of whether the chair and the CEO are the same person or held by 2 people. It was actually never regulated by SEC, but most companies are now providing it, and proxy advisory firms are looking for it. Again, the CEO pay ratio, our best guess is at the maybe our safest bet is that it will be delayed somewhat and maybe tweaked a little bit for the provisions that are most objectionable, maybe getting rid of overseas operations, getting rid of part-time and seasonal workers. But for the most part, it probably will stay in place as it's been finalized. Hedging and pledging, pay for performance, and clawback, it's all proposed. There's been, I think as we pointed out earlier, hundreds of thousands of comments submitted by interested parties, and the SEC is sort of mulling over this. We believe the hedging and pledging will probably come through at some point. Most companies have adopted policies on that one. Pay for performance is a little bit dicey and controversial. There's a lot of things in there that probably could use some tweaking, particularly with respect to using TSR as a measure. We think that one will be delayed somewhat. Clawbacks, really, until a couple of months ago, we thought, well, maybe this could be delayed or tweaked or changed, but given the Wells Fargo fallout, we think this one will probably go ahead. Probably quicker than the pay for performance finalization. The banking rules, remember these are the rules that regulated only certain banks in the financial sector. They were proposed in 2011, re-proposed in 2016, and we do think that there's probably, it's probably going to be high priority and perhaps modified and addressed by the SEC quicker than the other rules. So that's our view on where Dodd-Frank is going.
Deb, we had a great question from the audience that asked, do you anticipate any changes to SOX given the new administration?
That's interesting. That hadn't really been addressed because at this point it's so old. We've only really been focusing on Dodd-Frank, but certainly if they're sort of kind of pecking away at Dodd-Frank, they could look at SOX again and see what they like and don't like and what makes sense given that it's so many years later. So we'll turn now to the tax code, which is where many of you believe that there might be changes or changes are needed. And the first thing that we see is that Trump and his team have talked for a long time about lowering the top end tax bracket and simplifying, so it would go from 7 brackets to 3 brackets. And so what does that mean? Well, if it really does go from roughly 40% to 33%, and you believe that will be happening imminently, we probably expect to see far more executive compensation deferrals into years where the bracket's lower. However, going forward, it would mean that deferrals would probably decrease if the tax rate, wasn't expected to go below 33%. On Section 409A, which has really proven to be the Full Employment Act for many lawyers since 2007, the complicated nuances of delaying taxation. We've seen a lot of legislation introduced that would really simplify that, and things would simply be taxed as they vest, and it would also take out of 409A land things like severance and employment and change in control agreements, which were really never intended to be viewed as a deferral instrument. So some simplification in that area. A big one that both parties really talked about is getting rid of the carried interest loophole, which allowed certain private equity and hedge fund partners to be taxed at 20% rather than the top bracket. If that happens, of course, we'll have to relook at those positions and try to figure out the ways to best structure executive compensation for those individuals that will now be subject to regular income tax. Also, we've heard a lot of talk about elimination of the alternative minimum tax. The alternative minimum tax really rendered the use of incentive stock options really not that beneficial to executives. Again, the incentive stock option would have gives executives capital gains tax between grant and exercise, and the tax is delayed until sale, but has been of limited use with the alternative minimum tax. So if we eliminate it, we might see an uptick in the use of all ISOs. And this one is it's sort of a big one in executive compensation, reduction in corporate tax rate. If it indeed does go down from 35 to 15%, perhaps companies wouldn't be as concerned about all of the deductions that they were taking, and particularly trying to get the deduction for all of executive compensation over $1 million. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Section 162, which gives 162M, which gives us a loophole to make performance-based compensation awards to executives and still get the deduction. Well, maybe companies won't care about the deduction anymore. They'll stop jumping through the 162M loopholes, and we'll see more simply fixed pay, time-based restricted stock, and the like. You'll still have to fight with the proxy advisors and deal with their view of fixed pay and non-formulaic pay, but in terms of tax, it may not be as significant to the company. As was mentioned earlier, the new Fair Labor Standards Act was introduced by the Obama administration. It was supposed to take effect today, which would have meant that a lot of companies would be increasing salaries of some employees from about $23,000 to $47,000 in order to make them exempt from overtime rules. But just last week, a judge in the Eastern District of Texas granted a preliminary injunction on the changes to the FLSA, and that applies to all states, and we don't know how long that will be held up. So that's sort of a breaking news development. And our favorite one, which we're really hoping there's some movement on, is proxy advisor regulation. ISS and Glass Lewis have really sort of tried to control where we go with executive compensation in the past few years, and to do that, they provide a lot of proprietary models which have to be bought in order to understand how to pass ISS tests, and they divide the house to try to avoid this appearance of conflict, but at the end of the day, they're selling products, and they're telling us they're telling our investors how to vote their shares. So we're wondering if the SEC will step in this time and really gain some traction in trying to regulate what proxy advisors can and cannot do. So there you have it. It's sort of still up in the air. It's an enigma, but it's Perlmeyer's best guess about where the direction of all of this is going. But again, we recommend staying the course and looking at what's where to go in 2017. I'll turn it back to Terry.
Great, thanks, Deb. And yeah, certainly there's a lot of interesting discussion with respect to regulation in 2017 that boards and compensation committees will have to grapple with as things come down the pike. But in the meantime, there are really some other important non-regulatory questions that boards should be focused on and should be asking as it relates to compensation in 2017. And so we've attempted to lay out 5 which we think are pretty important. They're in no order of priority, but they relate to some important topics. The first of which is around this whole concept of informed discretion. How do boards use informed discretion as it relates to compensation actions? The second one is around how we create a competitive advantage in our pay programs and our compensation strategies. The third is around the role of the comp committee, and in particular, the expansion of that role. Number 4 is around this whole notion of pay fairness, and it comes on the back of the CEO pay ratio, but involves other items as well. And then last but not least, and Deb hit on this a little bit, is the proxy advisors and how are we proactive? How can we be proactive as it relates to their influence in executive pay? So these are 5 important items. I'd say that I know we have a lot of public company directors on the call. We also have a lot of private company directors on the call as well, and I think it's important to note that 4 out of these 5 would pertain to both. So they're very broad, strategic type items. And so with that, we're going to step through each one of these questions and get your views on some particular questions and also share our perspective on things. So question 1. At certain times, management may need to take short-term actions that are in the best long-term interest of shareholders but may negatively impact short-term results and thus compensation. So as a board and a comp committee, how do we manage this? So these would be things that would be not anticipated in the annual budget, operating plan, and the design of the compensation program. So if you think about some of the examples, it may be a disposition of an asset, a restructuring, a change in the business model that has financial or cost implications. And so how do we account for those things as it relates to compensation programs? Because we know in today's environment, short-term results are how the market is oriented. And so as a board, how do we make sure that we have a long-term focus and we help promote a long-term focus? So when there are items that may not be in the best interest from a compensation perspective in the short term, but are in the best interest of the company in the long term, how do we reflect that? And is there a formal framework or process that the committee can use to apply discretion? You know, this whole concept of informed discretion on a post facto basis. So this is what question 1 deals with, and we do have a polling question. And the question is, how often has your compensation committee exercised discretion with respect to the annual bonus plan, so the short-term annual cash bonus plan? This is a 2-part question. You'll see the second one coming up, but this one's particular to the bonus plan.
And, you know, as a comp committee chair or member, this is really the area which is very difficult, but it is the responsibility of the comp committee to make the decision. These are gray areas. It's judgment calls. You know, you approved the budget, you approved the goals, and now, you know, management is coming back to you with certain issues that have come up. And so this is where you really need to do soul searching and make sure you understand what the impact of your decisions are in each of these areas.
That's right. It's how do you effectively balance the formulaic results with good business judgment and making sure that you're doing the right thing that's fair and reasonable for the management team. So let's see how folks voted. Periodically, yeah. That's kind of how I expected it to be. I would have been surprised if it was never, and I also would have been surprised if the most common was almost always. So periodically makes good sense to me. Yeah. So why don't we move on to the second part now, which is the same type of question. It just deals with the long-term incentive plan. So these are a little trickier because typically they are either long-term cash incentive plans that span multiple years, or they are long-term equity-based compensation programs that have specific financial or other criteria. And so how would you vote on this? My sense is you're more likely to see folks in the camp of rarely as opposed to annually or periodically.
You know, as a comp committee, you know, person, that you really need to, what was the intent of the particular long-term incentive? Is it retention, and is the employee there? And it's hard to have the line of sight when you're 3 to 5 years, depending on what the terms are on these. So it does make it a little more difficult. And I would imagine maybe some people would do the long-term more frequently than the short-term. But the poll will let us know.
Yeah, we will see. Okay, well, I think we've had enough time elapsed, so let's check it out. Oh, I was right, Mary Beth. it is in fact rarely. That's not surprising to me. But interestingly enough, if you look at the top two combined, you've got almost 40% that do it periodically or even annually. So there are quite a few companies that are exercising discretion with respect to the long-term plans, and so that's an interesting finding. So with this, we'll move on to the next steps, for question number 1. So I think there are some important things that we can learn and use on a go-forward basis. And one of them that I've found particularly helpful is to use this whole concept of rules of the road, and so agreeing to rules of the road around adjustments up front. It's not going to capture everything, but these are more or less principles that can be used and applied to the various types of decisions that need to be made as it relates to these adjustments. And so the first is materiality, and that's really around the item's ability to have a material impact on the results, and particularly ongoing results. The second one is around consistency. And this is really around establishing a consistency with respect to the adjustments that you make. Is there any precedent? And whether or not those types of adjustments have been discussed in the past and how they were applied previously. The third is around accountability. So what was management's tie or responsibility to the items or the event, and how was that risk managed? And this can get into whether or not, in some cases, what you have is a turnover of the management team. And so how do you handle items that may be decisions from a prior management team that the new management team may not be held accountable for? And then the fourth is certainly disclosure. You'd want to make decisions where you'd know the disclosure impact and kind of operate under the principle of transparency. So those are some good rules of the road that can be established on the front end when you have to deal with these types of decisions. The other thing is to make sure that the measures themselves are balanced. So many companies nowadays have short-term incentive measures and long-term incentive measures. And how do you strike an effective balance between the measures that you use in both plans? Then there's communication. So we want to make sure that we have ongoing dialogue with management. I think it's always helpful to talk about these types of things over multiple meetings and make sure that everyone has the ability to express a point of view and come to consensus over time. And then last but not least is more on the tax side of the house, which is really to consider implementing a 162M umbrella plan. So that's a plan that can be used to provide the committee discretion, both positive and negative, while still preserving 162M tax deductibility. So that's question 1. Question 2 is next, and this is around the concept of competitive differentiation as it relates to compensation programs. So the question is, do we have compensation programs that create a competitive advantage? And how are our programs different than market? And do those differences actually help with attraction, retention, and motivation, which are typically the key objectives of compensation programs? So we know that over time that some of the external influencers in executive pay, be it proxy advisors, regulatory bodies, and the like, have unintentionally led to more conformity in the market. So what does that actually mean? Well, we've seen a narrowing of pay levels. It used to be the case that when you looked at compensation levels, there would be a wide distribution of data for, call it the same role, and that would reflect on all the other things outside of market data that compensation committees consider. So contributions on behalf of an individual, their performance, their role as it relates to the market data roles. And so we've seen over time that there's been a narrowing of the ranges of market data. Again, more conformity towards the median. 2 is that many companies have the same types of incentive plans and use the same types of measures. And so in some cases, those are measures that have been more or less prescribed by proxy advisors. And so this whole concept that there's little differentiation in incentive plan design can obviously lead to a lack of differentiation and a lack of competitive advantage. And then many companies are offering the same types of programs. So we think you should really turn this on its head, because a compensation strategy, by its very definition, should entail understanding your company attributes and what you can do differently, both internally and in comparison to the market, to create a competitive advantage. So what are those unique company attributes that should translate into pay design? What are the unique employee attributes, the profile of your employee population? And how do those translate to compensation design? And then how and what changes should we make to our programs to alter course? So we do have another polling question here. And it is, to what extent do your programs create a competitive advantage in attracting, retaining, and motivating individuals? And you can see the choices there.
You know, I think how we have created plans in the past really are going to be turned on its head with the influx of millennials, where it's not just all about the compensation, the dollars. It's a lot of other attributes of the full compensation plan, and I think companies need to be looking at their VP of HR of how strong they are versus making sure payroll gets out. So I think this is going to be an evolving area, given the individuals that are coming into the workforce and that are there currently. I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're entirely right. It's around, expanding the concept of compensation to be more total rewards, and even expanding total rewards to incorporate things that maybe historically weren't considered in the realm of rewards, but should be for the new generations that enter the workforce. So let's see what the audience thought. So nice bell distribution here. You can see somewhat is the most prevalent answer, followed by almost entirely, to some extent, 3%, almost 3% entirely, which is great. I think that's what we like to see, creating strategic and competitive advantage through your programs, and then 5% to no extent. So very interesting. Okay, so some next steps here. We touched on these a bit in the first slide, but it's really around taking a step back and evaluating the programs in the context of business and employees, and not necessarily wholly in the context of market practice or proxy advisor views. And so asking the key questions you can see on the slide, understanding how the answers to those questions should impact compensation and total rewards, and then arriving at recommended changes and designs really more focused on the internal perspective as opposed to a market perspective. And then once you arrive at those recommended changes and designs, overlaying the market to understand where the differences exist. And then further, do those differences support the strategy? Do they create competitive advantage? And always, want to keep an eye on proxy advisors and your investors, making sure that you don't do anything that's going to cause serious issue. So you adjust as needed, and then go about communicating and implementing programs. So those are the first two. I think now I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to cover the other three items in the top 5.
Thank you, Terry. I think that the concept of using compensation for competitive advantage is a nice segue into our third question, which is, should the Compensation Committee expand its role to include talent management? So the traditional focus of the Compensation Committee is on approving compensation benefits for senior executives, making sure that everything's in compliance. But if you really want to use compensation for strategic advantage, shouldn't the committee perhaps also be involved in other critical areas of talent management, like some of those listed on the screen: succession planning and leadership development, performance management and employee engagement, corporate culture, and ESG issues, which I think, further to the discussion about what millennials are looking for, I think that's going to be an increasingly important consideration if you want to be positioned as an employer of choice for the best and brightest new talent. So many companies may consider talent management and succession planning in particular responsibilities of the full board, But another question here implied is, without a specific committee responsible for leading the effort, does that talent management piece really get enough attention? Which leads us to our next polling question. Has your compensation committee expanded the formal committee name or charter to include non-pay related issues? I expect most companies haven't made a formal change yet, but I think that's certainly the trend. I don't know what you're seeing, Mary Beth.
Well, I think it's just starting to come to light for a lot of comp committees. We've had a lot on our plate up until this point, but I do think that's why I believe HR needs to play a bigger role at the committee level, and they need to be a stronger type of HR person than we've seen in the past at many companies. So I think if you want to attract the brightest and most talented to give yourself a competitive advantage, there's got to be things that have got to be addressed in the role of the committee to monitor that. So I don't know if a lot of committees haven't really addressed it yet.
Yeah, and I know it's been my experience and the committees that I work with that directors in general seem to be increasingly interested in these issues and appreciate being brought into the discussion. So let's take a look at how everybody answered here. So the top answer by far is no change to the charter or the name. About 27% that the charter's expanded the responsibilities, but the name hasn't changed. And then the charter and the name have changed, and about 12% of those who are on the call. This is sort of lines up with some of our own research, which indicated that, and looking at some recent proxy filings, about 20% of the S&P 1200 companies seem to have changed the name of the compensation committee to something like Org and Compensation or Talent Management or HR and Compensation in order to reflect this expanding responsibility. So this is interesting, but consistent with what I would have expected. So moving on to our next steps for question number 3. What can we suggest in this arena? Well, I would start by asking questions about the next level or two of talent on your bench. What's the company doing to target high potential employees and to ensure that the pipeline is diverse in multiple terms? I would also suggest that when thinking about the bench, make a distinction between the overall C-suite talent development and specifically identified CEO successors. So, for example, you could consider taking the approach of giving CEO candidates a designated board mentor. It gives opportunity to develop those candidates more thoroughly and also gives the board direct insight into the individual candidate's strengths and weaknesses instead of getting that feedback from the CEO and then just letting the CEO pick their successor. You also want to make sure that you stay informed on employee engagement and company culture, particularly in the wake of what happened with Wells Fargo. It's not just about understanding tone at the top, but also keeping abreast of what the culture is at the core. So some of the ways you might do this are through internal surveys, engagement surveys, site visits, or board members participating in town halls. And then with the increasing scrutiny on pay inequality or pay fairness issues, which we'll get to in a little bit more detail in just a moment, directors should also be kept apprised of what, if anything, the company is doing to track these issues internally, how they're planning to talk about these issues with the public, with employees, and with investors. So with that in mind, let's head on to our fourth question, which is, regardless of the outcome, whether the CEO pay ratio is abolished, implemented, or amended, we expect that the issue of pay inequality will remain a hot topic. So is your management team fully prepared to discuss, to address the internal and external questions on the subject? For one thing, the media is going to continue to push the subject. No matter what we think is going to happen to the pay ratio, there's just too much potential headline material here. I think also, just looking at the results of the election, there's a big blue collar working class push, I think, behind what happened in the election. So while investors may not think much of the CEO pay ratio, which has been what we've gathered so far, the working public does care. In addition, I think there are potentially huge internal challenges if the pay ratio disclosure goes into effect as we imagine it will right now. In fact, as noted here on the bottom of the slide, for most companies, we think the biggest concern about the pay ratio disclosure is that employees are going to be comparing themselves not to the CEO, whose pay they can already find in the proxy statement and have been able to find for many years, but to the median employee, whose pay level was not previously publicly available. And not only within their own company, not only comparing their pay to median pay in their own company, but what are competitors doing as well? So then raising issues about retention and attraction. And I think further to our mention of millennials earlier, I think millennials are, in particular, are pretty sophisticated about tracking down data. They're going to not only get a hold of the CEO pay data, but they're going to be aware of these ratios and what other people are paid. But at the same time, they're not necessarily as sophisticated or informed about how individual pay rates are determined. Many people aren't. Individual pay rates are really based on a basket of considerations, like individual skills, level of education, tenure, the criticality of the role in the industry, in your company in particular. But those considerations can be tough to boil down into concise and universally applicable guidelines that people can easily understand. And HR isn't currently always prepared to discuss them. So that leads us to our next polling question, where we're curious about how much you think the committee ought to be involved in crafting the narrative. Do you believe the committee should review and approve the company's communication strategy for responding to employees, investors, and the press? I'm going to guess that most directors think the answer is yes, or at least unsure. But I'm curious about what you think, Mary Beth.
Well, I think it's going to boil down to the group of people. I think when you look at the millennials, we've talked about them, and they are not shy of sharing their salaries to each other. So we may not even need to say a pay to a certain point because they're going to talk about it, and that is different than our generation where you never talked about it. So I think it's going to be definitely an issue, and I think that the HR department needs to be able to communicate this effectively about the median pay and understanding it. That they're not going to take no for an answer. They're going to want to have the details behind it. I think they're going to definitely push this issue.
Yeah, that's a great point about the fact that they're just not shy about sharing this information. That's a great point. So let's see what everybody had to say here. So yes, as I would have expected, the vast majority of you on the call think that the committee ought to be involved in reviewing and approving that narrative. I agree. I think that the committee needs to be aware. There's too much on the line here for the committee to not be involved, to at least to a certain extent, at least to be aware of what management's plan is and what's being done to prepare. So in that vein, what are the next steps? First, I would say draft the narrative. Determine the level of detail you want to provide. Is it going to be a minimum amount to be in compliance, or do you want to provide more context around the numbers to help address some of the potential issues and questions? And what are the pros and cons of each of these approaches, of keeping it closer to the vest or providing more information, being more transparent? Then where does the narrative show up? You want to decide if you're going to have it part of the CD&A as part of the overall compensation discussion, or do you give this issue its own section outside the discussion of compensation for the company's NEOs? Is this a broader issue that needs to be addressed separately? And then, of course, prepare for the inevitable questions. You want to develop collateral materials for the internal teams, career ladders, career development maps, talent management approaches. What kind of skills, background, or level of experience do you think go along with the pay levels attached to the median employee? When people look at that number, what does it mean? What kind of characteristics might that person have in your particular talent tree. Identify the individuals internally who you think are best informed and able to discuss these issues effectively, and then make sure that you're doing everything you can to prepare them for those conversations. And then look externally. Where else will your employees be gathering information from themselves, from each other, obviously, and then how are competitors or other industries going to be addressing these issues? Where else might employees be getting their information? We have the question on the screen, will employees be smarter on pay issues than in the past? And I think as we've talked about, we can expect that they'll be able to gather more information, but how do you wade through or get ahead all of that noise to get your message across effectively? That's the key question. So move on to our final question for today, and we've arrived at the monster at the end of our book, to draw on the title of one of my favorite little golden books, everyone's favorite villains, the proxy advisory firms. For better or worse, they continue to wield significant influence in the realm of executive compensation, and we think they're here to stay. So assuming that they're a reality of life going forward, how do you get out ahead of their recommendations and avoid being sent to the penalty box? I think at a very high level, advisory firms function as, I think of them as sort of data aggregators of a sort, right? They're collecting and then disseminating lists of generally accepted best practices, which during the best of times are, they're followed by a lot of your investors and they're generally benign. However, the advisory firms also employ formulaic assessments of pay and performance alignment that don't factor in issues like alignment with business and talent strategy, or, for example, the committee's focus on retention risk. So their models can end up triggering concern during challenging times, even if you're doing everything that you're supposed to and you're remaining consistent with your philosophy and you're aligning pay and performance. If things are rough for your company or your industry, some of those models can suddenly break, and everyone at the proxy advisory firms and then some of your investors become focused on issues that were previously not controversial and suddenly are huge levels of concern. So faced with this potential for pushback, we often find that committees will take a tough stance, sticking to their guns on what makes sense for their specific company. But we've also seen that resolve break down when the vote becomes rough. And then suddenly everyone becomes focused on checking all the boxes in order to avoid any future issues. We advise strongly against allowing a difficult vote to completely sway an approach that the committee knows is right for your company, even if that approach is unconventional or unpopular. There's a middle ground, so be deliberate. So if we move on to our next poll, has your compensation committee developed a formal response plan for the proxy advisory firm's negative reports or votes? I don't know about the committees you're on, Mary Beth, but I think that the committees that we work with and the management teams and consultants in general have gotten better about predicting where we think the advisory firms may come down, and I think it benefits you to try and get out ahead.
Oh, absolutely. And they will, ISS Glass Lewis, ISS for sure, will give you a scorecard rating on each section that they talk about, plus the overall ahead of time. So you'll see where the issues that they think are issues that you can at least address when you are reaching out to your institutional investors. So if you don't have a plan, you're kind of in trouble. If you are going to have less than a 1 or a 2 overall rating, you really do need to address it so that the votes that you have at your proxy are in the way that management wants to have them go. So,
yeah, I just think I think there's enough information out there. When we first saw the first round of Say on Pay, there were a lot of supplemental proxy filings in response to these negative recommendations. I think most companies now have gotten good about trying to get out ahead. So you're addressing where you think the potential issues are in your CD&A and potentially even talking to the advisory firms in the off season to try and lay the groundwork for some of the other things that you're doing.
Yeah, totally agree.
So let's see what everybody had to say. So little over half, not formally, but routinely discuss how you would handle potential issues. That's not terribly surprising. I think for most companies, just on the percentages in any given year, you don't have an issue with the advisory firms. But for those companies who do, when they arise, it can be significant. So I think you still want to make sure that you get out in front of it, and at least most people on that call are discussing this periodically, which I think you have to do. So, what are the next steps to prepare for this? To prepare for dealing with the advisory firm. So, set aside time in the 2017 agenda to develop an approach that you want to take every year with dealing with these issues. I think first you want to understand which advisory firm has the most influence on your shareholders. For most of you, that will be ISS, but for some of you, there may be a critical mass of shareholders that follow Glass Lewis pretty closely. You want to be aware of both organizations' checklists for sure. Review past reports to make sure that you're aware of any trends from year to year. Are there issues that are sitting there in the background that are gaining increasing higher profile that may rear their head if another issue arises? So just be aware of where those latent issues may be hiding. Then critically understand where your individual shareholders stand on key pay-related issues. So it's possible for the committee to insulate itself to a degree with a well-apprised set of top shareholders. Regular direct outreach to key shareholders can help make sure that they're not blindly following ISS or Glass Lewis because they understand better what the company is trying to accomplish through the compensation program and have faith that management understands their concerns. So if you're talking to them regularly, not only do you understand the things that are going to be important to your individual shareholders, but they understand that you're looking out for their interests. And once again, don't feel compelled to comply with every like-to-have provision on the advisory firm list. They send out their ISS will send out a quality score rating, and you've dropped a point, and you look more risky than one of your peers, and you scramble to try and figure out which boxes you can check to reduce that score further. I think it's important to look at each of those like-to-have provisions that the advisory firms have and figure out which ones are reasonable gives and which ones are just going to put you in a box that you don't want to be in, that it's not worth. Then address potential concerns in the CD&A. Make sure you're clearly communicating your philosophy on the alignment of your program with your strategy. Keeping out ahead of these potential issues can help you avoid overreacting when a recommendation goes against you, and you can stay focused on your unique strategy and don't lapse into a simple compliance mode where you've been previously using your program to competitive advantage. So with that, I'll kind of move on and summarize our key takeaways for today. I'd say first, you want to make sure that you develop a long-term strategy or perspective that can provide direction and help you to weather short-term peaks and valleys, to avoid overreaction and help you to know where you can afford to give ground and where you need to put your foot down. Number two, the current environment of uncertainty presents an opportunity or a cue to step back and holistically evaluate your compensation programs independent of outside influences. Are we doing all the things to give us that competitive advantage through the compensation program? Three, improve executive engagement and alignment by integrating your compensation program with your leadership and talent strategy. Number four, understand your company's public position and messaging on pay inequality issues, or at least what's being done to prepare for that message. And finally, number five, recognize the benefits of a proactive shareholder engagement strategy and the value of effective communication in shielding you from near-term overreaction and advancing long-term value creation. So I think that wraps up the points that we wanted to make. And I think we've got a little bit of time left if there were any questions or items for further discussion.
We did get some questions from the audience that I'd like to at least ask, and if one of you could answer them. The one question we received that I'll start with is, what is the best practice for private companies when it comes to proxy disclosure for pay ratios?
Wow. I don't want to give everybody a chance here to respond, but I would think that the best practice really is to be aware, to try to work through the process that you would go through if you were a public company, with the expectation that your employees may have those questions of you, especially if you're a larger private company with a higher profile. This may become an issue that you want to address, even if you don't talk about the pay ratio, to be able to talk about on a little bit more informed basis about how you think about pay and career progressions and skills and competencies and how they connect. I think that's important.
Yeah, and it's Terry. I'd say that I do work with one large private company that they operate under the principle that they want to emulate a public company from a governance perspective, and so they actually, for their compensation committee, they actually go through and they do the full public company disclosures and show their compensation committee how they would look if they were a public company. So that might be one kind of leading edge way to do it, but recognizing that it's not a requirement that you do it.
Right, I agree.
Another question that we received was, I'd like to get your thoughts on it. Do you think there's going to be a shift, either pro or con, in the use of performance shares, or the view of the proxy advisory firms that stock options are not considered performance shares?
I would, on the stock option question, I would say I don't expect a shift. I don't know, all of my colleagues, what kind of conversations that they've had, but here in our office, we've tried repeatedly reaching out to ISS and trying various permutations of stock options to say, well, what if we do this or this or this? If you put a premium on the exercise price, you'll get credit for them being performance-based. Otherwise, they're not looking at it that way. I think they look at them as lottery tickets, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon.
I think you're right, David, and I think we're going to continue to see the rise of performance-based shares, not stock options, performance-based full value shares, and that we've seen that over the past 5 years. It's been, I'd say, meteoric in nature, and I don't think you'll see the same dynamic with options. If anything, you'll continue to see the prevalence of options wane, because you actually get penalized by ISS if you use stock options because they value them on a full term basis, whereas most companies use the accounting value. So there is a bit of a penalty for using options.
And I would expect that too. I would expect that trend to continue with full value performance-based shares. I would add as one qualifier, though, that the more you reach out to your shareholders directly, what I've seen is that you hear shareholders talk about stock options, that shareholders understand the value of using stock options, even if the proxy advisory firms don't. So if you think that options make sense for you, especially, for example, if you're in an industry downturn and you're really looking at trying to drive a return to appreciation over the near term, stock options can be a very powerful incentive, and your shareholders may actually agree with you that they are performance-based.
Yep.
Well, I would like to thank Perlmutter and all of the speakers today. This has been a wonderful discussion that we've had, and obviously we are treading on new waters of what's going to happen in 2017. I'd like to thank our audience for the questions and the participation and being on the call.